Hello and welcome to the People, Place and Nature podcast. Now, summer is coming and we're all getting back into our beautiful gardens, but actually, are they as sustainable as perhaps they should be? Maybe you don't have as much time as usual this year, or you're struggling to keep on top of things. If so, this week's guest may be of particular interest to you, as we're talking with Marian Boswell about sustainable gardens and landscapes, and what we can all do to try and make our own gardens a little bit better for nature and more sustainable as well, and the importance of them for healing and sensory purposes too. I really enjoyed this episode, as not only did we get to sit in Marian's wonderful garden, but because it talked a lot about the role of the soul and how important it is to factor that into our spaces too as we design them. So I hope you enjoy this episode. Make sustainability a priority throughout the design process with a suite of tools built specifically for landscape architecture and design. Vectorworks gives you the freedom to follow your imagination wherever it may lead, with remarkably flexible software that integrates BIM for landscape and GIS workflows. Sketch, model, and document in a single tool with the world's most design-centric BIM solution. Discover Vectorworks' landmark and design without limits. Visit vectorworks.net to learn more. Hi Marion, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for having us in your beautiful garden. Absolutely amazing spot. It's certainly, we were just saying, one of the highlights of the podcast and being able to come to places like this, and your garden is absolutely fantastic.
Thank you.
So thank you very much for having us. And I thought we could start by just having a bit of an introduction into your kind of background and how you've come into doing what you're doing now, because you didn't start necessarily in this world. And I think it's really interesting to understand how people have come to where they are and what kind of things have led them to do what they're doing now, because you're doing some really interesting and important stuff. So it'd be nice to know how you kind of progressed through and got to where we are now.
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me. And it's lovely to have you here. I think I tend to agree with you that it's so valuable to build on everything you learn and to take it to the next stage of life. And I definitely have come through a variety of different careers. So I read French and Italian to begin with, and then I went to Marks and Spencer as a graduate, and I did their graduate trainee program back in the day when Marks and Spencer, British Grass and the Royal Family were the sort of iconic brands of the 1980s. I then went to work as a management consultant for several years, and that was a baptism of fire, really. Very interesting, very high energy, working with lots of strategic companies at a corporate level. Some of them doing lots of good, some of them doing less good, and after that, I slightly bombed out of the corporate world. My second child died, and I felt then that I shouldn't completely subcontract my whole life. So I had colleagues who had day nannies, night nannies, and weekend nannies, and I just thought, actually, I'd like to live my life and to do something else. I didn't mean to become a garden designer. I took on this garden and sort of had to learn how to look after it. So I did some rapid learning, and over 10 years I did horticulture, garden design, landscape design, and then landscape architecture, the masters, and then went back to teach landscape architecture at Greenwich. And in the process of that, started being asked to design other people's gardens, and I set up my studio. And I figured that because I was kind of, well, not middle-aged, but I was older, that I didn't want to go and work for a big company. I really wanted to set up my own company with my own rules, because I found working in the corporate world quite exhausting, if you like, on many, many levels. And I also thought that there's a better way, has to be a better way to run a business. So I brought people in, really good landscape architects. It's almost like a reverse apprenticeship, if you like. So I brought people who are more experienced than me to work with me. And it really grew from there. And I've done that for 20 years now. So we have some wonderful clients, and I have a really, really fantastic team. So I'm very lucky.
No, that's brilliant. Yeah, that's a really interesting intro into, how you've come to where you are. But now you're doing so much in the sort of garden design world, and you're really, a figurehead sort of leading so many aspects of it, especially around sustainability and things. So I wondered, would you like to talk a little bit about maybe your book first, and a bit about what sort of inspired you to create the book? And what you... And the book talks a lot about what you've done here and how this garden's come to be. Now, we've been lucky enough to have a wander around. But I think if you could explain some of the things you've designed here, and then people can get the book and they can see it for
Well,
themselves.
they don't have to get the book yet. Yes, but yeah. So, well, thank you. And thank you. And you haven't taken your shoes off and walked around the meditation spiral yet, but we could do that afterwards.
I'd love to give that a go.
Yeah, it's really nice. So the book came out of really the way that my studio has developed. And over the years, really working in historic gardens is a very good training ground for really honouring the past and thinking very, very long term. So because I worked a lot in historic gardens, understanding the history, the topography, the geology, the water, as well as the environment, is quite a gentle way of designing. And also there's not much room for ego, because there's usually been a lot better designers than me in the past in these places. You know, if you're following the footsteps of Capability Brown, you don't have too many delusions of grandeur.
Yeah.
So I think that was quite a good start. And then people would say, would be talking about sustainability, and I thought, well, actually, that's kind of what I am trying to do, and I wanted to get out as quickly as possible the thoughts to as many people as possible, which is why I wrote the book, because it's very accessible. Whereas, you know, coming to a designer isn't for everybody, but actually picking up a book or photocopying a book, I always encourage people just to take pictures of the key pages if they can't afford it, because it's the message. It's sharing the message, which is what it's all about. And also, as you know, I met Eric Anderson a few years ago, and we started talking about the Sustainable Landscape Foundation, which we co-founded, and really to get the message out that I wrote it in lockdown, so it was sort of, we were slightly held up in our aspirations for getting the word out via the foundation. So it's okay, how can we really get the message out and help as many people to think sustainably? And it's a strange thing about our industry, as you know from the work you're doing, that although a garden looks green, it doesn't necessarily mean it's doing lots of good. It could actually be doing quite a bit of harm.
Yeah.
So to really think about all the decisions that go into creating a space, whether it's a garden or a bigger landscape, once you understand the framework and understand what your decisions are and what they're impacting, it's fairly simple to do good, but there's lots of sort of routes which you could go down, which are more harmful than others. So you and I were talking about water earlier on, and how you use water, how you recycle water. And I always like to think of us as guardians of water. So what happens when water comes through our house? Does it leave in better shape than it arrived, or have we filled it with chemicals and hormones and fertilizers and, you know, other poisons, essentially? Have we used more than we might have done? Is there a way of using less and recycling it? And how can we keep it on the land for as long as possible? That then leads into soil. You know, how healthy is our soil? Because the healthier our soil is, the more it will take up water, the better sponge it is. Have we got lots of microbes in the soil? Are we feeding our microbes, the herd, the unseen herd underground? And yeah, all of these things are interconnected, but you can actually pick them apart and study each one. And holistically, we often have that kind of gut feel of what's good and what's not good, but actually marrying that with the logical decision making, I think, is very helpful on a day-to-day basis.
No, I completely agree. I think what you mentioned about taking egos out of it is very interesting, because it can be quite a dominated profession by that in many instances. And I think that's a really interesting way to approach design, where, you know, obviously I design projects too and things, but when you do come to look at places and what's made those places and what does make those places unique, it's the heritage, it's the local soil types, it's the local landscape, and local architecture and things like that. So being able to embed that and use that as a guiding principle for whatever it is you do can be quite a humbling process, I think, and is a really important process to help reaffirm those things in whatever you're doing, which is really really important to make sure places are then contributing to the future as well, of maintaining those characteristics and things. And although things can be changed and adapted, there's a lot that can really be looked at, but being able to do that in a way where you don't necessarily impose your ego, I think, can be incredibly challenging. But one of the most valuable things about sort of our profession, and what I like with a lot of the people we talk to, is many of them do have a cause above themselves. And I think that's one thing I've really felt coming from you since we met, in that it's not just about coming in and designing a garden for people to use it for now, even though obviously that's a major part of it. It's thinking, okay, well, how does that contribute to the future in whatever way, and across the many sort of spectrums and interconnectivities that happen in the process of a design and its use over time. Yeah,
I think you're absolutely right, that the whole kind of why are we here and what are we doing, and what's the point? And whilst it's lovely to be in a beautiful space, what else is that space for? What's it doing? And what is the purpose of us and of design and of being designers? So I like to think of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So at the base, we need to feel safe, we need food, and so on. And as we get up our hierarchy of needs, then we start looking for love, and finally we look for like a higher purpose in life. And I mean, we're very fortunate, can't you? Obviously, both of us, in that we have a lot. So then, kind of, what can we do next? As far as taking egos out of it, it's funny, isn't it? You can kind of check yourself off sometimes if you are. I can check myself sometimes if I'm doing a design and then I'm thinking, no, I want it to be like this, and I have to be thinking, well, why? Is it because I think it looks much better than that other person thinks it is, or do I think actually that it will make the people that I'm designing for happier? And in that second case, then I'm really happy to sort of argue my case, because I'm very clear when I'm designing is putting the person or the people, it can be many people that we're designing for, in a space and changing how they feel. And I know that you've worked in sort of big schemes where you're really making a big difference. I tend to work in rural schemes when I am making a difference, but to fewer people, but to a lot of land. So if we're cleaning up water and adding hedgerows and bringing in wildlife, then I think that makes a huge difference to a scheme. And I'm not here for very long. None of us are here for very long.
Indeed.
So it doesn't really matter in the end who contributes what, does it?
No, exactly. I think as long as we all tread lightly and try and leave the world in a better place for the people that come after us. And I think the hierarchy of needs demonstrates that really well. It's come up a few times actually on the podcast. Tim Hopkin from the Land app actually was the first person to bring it up, saying that was a major driver in understanding, if we don't get those fundamentals right, everything else falls apart, and it's making sure that we've got a solid base to build on and help others and secure all these things. And if you don't have that, then everything is much harder. So being able to understand that and contribute to those things wherever possible really is very important. And I think also we're very fortunate because it's a design profession. You can see everyone's ideas more than just hear them a lot of the time as well. So you get to sort of see how people think and what's the way they approach problems in a very different way to perhaps you do in other professions. And I found that I can have quite a dominating personality. I'm quite loud, I'm quite big, so I can be quite imposing. But I found that now, once you kind of observe that and you can see that happening, as you say, sometimes you have to step back and go, oh, hang on a minute. I've tried to move my role into more of a facilitation role now, to kind of being, okay, how do I use sort of my skill sets to enable other people to kind of have their say and discuss things. And you mentioned about how you built your team as well in your practice, and I think that chimed with me quite a lot, because I've tried to do a very similar thing. I've tried to bring in people that have very different skills to me to go, okay, what can I do, but what can't I do? Okay, what I can't do is where I need other people to come in and fill that, and that might be have a more sensitive touch or understanding angle, as much as it may be more experience or understanding of like specific issues. So I've tried to build a team sort of that way to look at a lot of these problems.
Yeah, and I think how different people work is really interesting. So I don't know if you know Susan Cain's book Quiet. It's about introverts, and I really like different ways of bringing people out. So like in group work, we often do a brainstorming when each person will write, and we'll dump our own ideas and then share them, because because sometimes brainstorming, when people are writing on the board or whatever, somebody might not want to throw something out, so that's just a way of capturing, an easy way of capturing people who aren't necessarily into kind of group work and group think.
No, I agree, and I think you need to have your own ideas challenged a lot. I do quite often still think that my way is the right way, but I do try and do something along those lines where I try and say, okay, because I think it's an important part of learning and training as well. For me anyway, the way I learn is very much doing something, being told why it's wrong, or having it sort of annotated or whatever, saying, look, if you look at it from that perspective, then it changes your approach to it. And I think I'm a more visual person, so I think seeing and understanding things that way is really valuable. So with our team, we very much have an approach of trying to say, okay, let's all come up with ideas. Everybody go away and draw something, just a quick 5-minute sketch. What do you think should go where? How could something be laid out? How do we resolve whatever problem it may be? And then we can kind of have a look. We go through all of those, and I try and always do my one last, because then everybody else has had a chance to speak and sort of be heard. So you do kind of end up in this interesting sort of leadership position that I perhaps, even though I'm running a company, I perhaps wouldn't have thought myself to necessarily be in. But I think that translates a lot into the actual client side job, because more and more of what we're doing, be it garden design, landscape design, or whatever, a lot of it now is very much going and talking to teams of people that are outside your profession, the public, clients that don't necessarily understand what we're doing or why, and being able to then have a very similar discussion with them, saying, look, let's look at it from this perspective, or let's try and understand it a different way, or look at it a different way. And it creates a very different sort of working relationship as well, which is much more sort of collaborative than perhaps things have been in the past.
I started off as a management consultant in the 1980s, and the difference in and a lot of what we did then was change management. So I'm trained in how to do that sort of thing, but the difference of intention, if you're coming at it from a point of real truth and really each collaborator wanting to do the best. I was really heartened recently. I was at a Beaver conference last week, and they had a team from Southwest Water, I think it was one of the water companies, and they have actually hired Beaver experts to be in their company, which was, first of all, that was fantastic, but also how these people were coming to the audience, the group, to ask for input was really heartening, and how they were taking information on board. And some people were upset with what's happening and so on, and that's fair enough. But there was much more of that kind of dialogue and ability to listen and to change and to do better, I guess, which I think is a new. I guess we're all learning really that it's only us. There are no grown-ups in the room apart from us, and we've kind of, it's now or never that we have this unique position in history that we've arrived at a time of real crisis, a biodiversity crisis, climate crisis, water crisis, and what are we going to do?
Exactly, and it makes it an incredibly exciting time, but even in the short time I've sort of been doing this, I've seen such a massive shift in the way people are talking about these problems, and it is much more collaborative. And I think we're going into a time where it's much more, let's get as many heads around the table to look at this from as many perspectives as possible, to really understand a problem and come up with a range of solutions than perhaps we ever have before. So I think the whole dynamic is shifting, but also we're going through one of the other big challenges is the lack of experts, because most of the professions are in decline that actually deal with a lot of these problems. So there has to be a greater onus of collaboration between professions, but also within professions. And, one of the things we've really tried to do is work with lots of other practices to sort of try and support one another and, bring in experts on specific things where they're needed, where we may not have those expertise, because none of us can do everything. And we need to make sure that we're doing things in the best way that we possibly can.
Yeah. Well, I recently, I'm not sure but I've done 4, and I'm about to do another. I do a workshop day for designers and people who are working sustainably or want to work sustainably. They come for the day, and I basically tell them anything they want to know. So I open my books, I show them how I do pricing, I show them how I set up our systems, how we do the drawings, how we do the research, anything they want to know, basically, on the basis that we need more good designers, and it's that stuff that holds us up.
Yeah.
To be able to get out and do good design, you need to be secure in your office, you need to make enough money, you need to have all of the things like insurance and best practice and all those sorts of things which you learn on the pathway to chartership and so on. You need all that. So if we can get more people to have all that, and you can't learn over all of it in college. So I really feel that the more better people we have, the quicker we're going to solve lots of problems.
Yeah, I think so. And I think that's, again, why it's important to understand where people have come from, because a lot of people that are in these sort of severe spheres and doing a lot of this work haven't come from traditional routes. That's one of the things I've really found quite surprising and interesting. I mean, I didn't necessarily, although I always worked in sort of conservation and the environment in some respect, but I never went purely sort of landscape. And I think that's very interesting because, as with anything, you need a diverse set of opinions and skill sets. So you need people to come into any profession with diverse backgrounds. And I think we've really missed a trick over the last few decades of sort of pigeonholing and following very sort of linear paths into professions. And actually we should be going, no, we want people coming in that are bringing new ideas, new strategies and different perspectives as well. Obviously there's core skill sets that everybody needs, but there also needs to be a range of sort of understanding to sort of break the traditions and innovate to be able to tackle some of these problems more efficiently and more effectively. But in order to do that, you might not have as much experience as if you just went down the linear route, which comes back to what you're saying about the designer days being even more important and having a really key role in helping people sort of get established, understand the principles and core things that they need to do. I think the way we're doing pretty much everything is changing at the moment, and it's quite exciting, really.
Yeah, hugely. And the Landscape Institute have been very good. I was on the committee for opening up the pathway to becoming an accredited professional. So you don't just have to you don't have to be just a landscape architect. You can come up through other ways. And I think that's really important too, that we get more people working with designing how we're all going to live. Yeah. Because that's really it, isn't it? Urban designers or rural designers, it's designing how we should live in the future.
Yeah.
And hopefully then getting into policy. I mean, through the Sustainable Landscape Foundation, we've talked to policymakers, and I know you're talking to those kinds of people as well. And they need to come from all sorts of different backgrounds in order to create the best routes. And again, at this Beavers conference, talking to Natural England and hearing them preparing papers for ministers in order to help things come through, and saying to them, well, what's the process? How can you help the process speed up? Is it like planning permission? Do they have 8 weeks and they need to get back to you? And the answer is no. So maybe we even need to start thinking about how that works.
I think as well, we had we did another podcast earlier today on sort of food, farming, policy and sort of public perception. Yeah. And one of the things that sort of really that came out of that was, the perfect is the enemy of the good. And there's never going to be perfect policy. And that's something that has to be factored into policy. There has to be an ability to amend and update and respond to changing circumstances, needs and everything else. And everything we do is a trade-off. That's the other thing. We're always trading something off against something else. And it's understanding where those trade-offs are and why some might be more important than others. But then also being able to understand how we can revisit things in order to correct potential mistakes if they've been made by us trading off the wrong thing at the wrong time. So that's all part of the discussion as well, which I think is very often missed. I think things like policy are quite often deemed as final when actually they are a work in progress. And it's very easy to forget that. But there's a lot going on with the government at the moment. We've just been appointed to quite a large project to sort of look at how we address sort of catchments and things, which is quite interesting, which will be advising ministers. So we're quite excited to find out a bit more about that soon. But because we don't know much about it yet, but we've been appointed to it.
Fantastic.
So
well done.
and that's being able to understand the impact we can have across catchments at different levels, from urban to sort of rural. And we need more of that. But at the same time, we also need more action, because the flip side is we spend an awful lot of time and energy on research opposed to application. So there has to be sort of a fine line of going, okay, right, we have a good enough understanding for the time being. That's not to say we don't stop researching it. We carry on researching it. But at this point, let's crack on and actually implement a load of this stuff. And then if it's wrong, it's wrong, but at least we've done something and learned from that process.
And what's the worst that can happen?
Yeah.
I think that's the other thing, isn't it? I mean, sometimes getting it wrong could have huge consequences. And sometimes it's not going to have that higher consequence. And you heard a bit of that frustration at this beaver conference again, with some people saying, well, what if some people were just going to let some beavers out? What? Which wasn't deemed a good idea. But yes, what are we going to do? And how can we work with people to explain as well? I think it's really tricky, and I mean the media is actually at fault quite a lot for wanting a story and wanting an angle and stirring up trouble an awful lot of the time. Obviously, a lot of media is trying to educate and also just tell a story, which is a good, I say good, it's all relative, but is a fair story. But sometimes when any government is trying to do stuff, it's all muddied, isn't it? And we end up in conflict.
Yeah, I think it can be very polarizing. Again, this came up earlier today, because the trouble is you always hear the extremes of the argument, whereas the reality is it's nearly always in the middle. Like, there's of course extreme points of view, but actually, broadly speaking, most people would probably be happy with some intermediary position. It's just that's very rarely portrayed, and you end up in a situation where you have people's backs up, or something along those lines, where they close down, they shut down, they don't necessarily listen in the same way, and then they're not willing to have that discussion, and that's incredibly damaging. So some of these things can be their own worst enemy. You can have an incredible environmental project, but all you have to do is promote it the wrong way. Farming is a fantastic example of this. Farmers are often demonized, and actually they're the people that have the most to offer and most to give, and the most important people to talk to. And if they put their backs up and don't want to talk about it, then it's everybody's loss, which is a real shame. And I think that's not necessarily always the case, but I think it's quite often portrayed that way through the media. Everybody understands we've got to produce food, but quite often that narrative is distorted, I would say.
We've got to produce food, and we've got to pay the farmers.
Yeah.
And for the food, as opposed to, not as opposed to other things, as in the public goods. I do understand that, but some of the strange things we've paid for them in the past, I think perhaps have done as much damage. We're very excited to be working with some very good farmers on some new projects, where they are really interested in doing some silviculture, so getting some rows of trees and so on in the middle of perfectly normal agricultural crops. So working with a dairy farmer who is interested in improving his soil and working with the floodplains, so grazing cattle on the floodplain. I find that hugely exciting, and letting hedgerows grow and working. I mean, that's where countryside stewardship needs to catch up a little bit. You can be paid for some of those sorts of things, but also you can actually have money taken, or historically you could have money taken away if you didn't cut your hedgerows. So all these sorts of things, I think we are all catching up, and the more trust really, and I think an ability to talk to one another is how we're going to actually come to a point of balance.
I think so, yeah, and seeing what people have done and learning from their mistakes. I think, some of these things are crazy, like with the clipping of the hedges, really we should be letting them grow a lot bigger and a lot more wild than perhaps they are right now. In some places and other places, you know, perhaps they should be more maintained. I don't know, depending on the history of the area and things. But it's those sort of things, I think, which are quite often missed or just not really valued in discussions, I think. Do you want to talk a bit about some of the projects that you're working on at the moment then? And because we were saying before when we were having a coffee and a conversation before the podcast about how you've really shifted your sort of client base to sort of tie in with what you want to do and also what you think is important.
Yes.
Values.
Yeah. Well, thanks for asking. So so we did a lot of historic garden work and estates, and had a bit of a rethink last year, and decided that I was finding that I was getting lots of work in, really, really happy and lucky and very, very fortunate to be offered lots of work. And I was kind of saying yes to too much. And then I was employing more people in order to service more work. And then I was getting more work in order to keep more people employed. And I found it was difficult to do that and to be absolutely sure that every piece of work was for the sort of client that I wanted to work for, on the sort of project that I wanted to work on. And so I took a very bold step and reduced my team and reduced my client base, and said that we're really only going to work on projects that make us feel really good. And that's a gut feel. It's a head and heart decision. And also, whilst we do have a good fee structure and so on, that money isn't the only currency. That it's not just about making more money and having more people and growing bigger. And it has been wonderful. It's been absolutely fantastic, and I think my team would agree that we're all really happy that we're working for some incredible people who want to do some wonderful things, and the projects are so exciting. I mean, and also I know, like you, I'm much more interested in learning than anything else. So I want to know how to do better in all different areas. And as a landscape architect, you never stop learning. We'll die half trained, a bit like my spaniel. So yes, just to be able to enter all these new areas and to be able to, really focus on what makes us all feel good has been a great thing to do.
Yeah, and how have you found that sort of transition? Have you found people sort of understanding of that when you've sort of declined work? Have you tried to make that sort of clear to clients, saying, look, this is the kind of work we really want to try and do? Is that something you're interested in? And they're very open of sort of saying, oh no, not really, we just want a fancy garden. Does that come up a lot? Do you find many people are actually very sympathetic to it, or?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's one of those lovely things about just being open and honest, isn't it? And knowing your boundaries and no hard feelings. That this is what we want to do, and that's what you want to do, and is there a match? And if there is, great, and if there isn't, well, lovely. We might recommend somebody else, or they might know other people. And I think it's much better to do that at the outset than to sort of trundle along feeling a bit miffed and unhappy, and maybe it all falls apart later on. Maybe it's a bit like a prenup or something, which I've never done. But yes, I think, yes, it's that knowing yourself as well, isn't it? And sometimes when I've spoken to some garden designers and talked about sustainability and so on, and they've said, well, they didn't really know what sort of garden design they wanted to do. But I think once you have decided, then it's so liberating, because you just know it's a yes or no answer, isn't it? It's yes, I want to do that. Yes, please, I really want to do that. Or it's kind of not really. And if it doesn't make me feel brilliant, then, I could go and potter around in my own garden instead, or, go and work in a community garden. We'd also do pro bono work. So we help design hospital gardens or physic garden, that sort of stuff. So we're open to doing that. That also makes us feel good.
Yeah, no, that's really important. Yeah, we do a lot of trying to help other people with various sort of community projects and things. And I was telling you about some of the water things we're doing, where we're prioritising either people that need it or organisations that need it, like schools and charities and community groups and things like that.
Sounds amazing what you're doing. I really,
thank you very much. So but those values, I think, are coming more and more to the fore, and people are understanding, the social value in what we do as well as just the environmental, which is another shift that's sort of happening now. Before it was all environmental, whereas now it's much more about social responsibility too, and how did they all entwine together. And it's really fantastic to see. Do you want to talk a bit more about the book as well?
Funnily enough, it comes back to that.
Well,
because,
that's what I was going to say, yeah.
Because I start off by talking about kindness. And I think if you can be kind to yourself. So what I did at the end of last year was very kind to myself. It was not unkind to my previous team members either, because I found them really good. I helped. I mean, they found it for themselves, but I helped them to get really good positions in really good other places. They're probably much happier now than they were when they. But I think if you can be kind to yourself, first and foremost, that shines out. And it's only really when you can be kind to yourself that then you can be kind to your partner or your child or your dog or the person you meet on the street. And once that flows, then that's a great decision-making tool again, isn't it? I mean, it's the classic do no harm, or do unto others as you would have them do unto you. The golden rule, as one of my clients would say. And then that makes every decision. Like, am I going to dump these chemicals in this water? Well, no, because it wouldn't be kind to myself, essentially.
Yeah.
Do you know water's fine? I'm sure you do, because you're a water specialist, but I didn't know that until a few years ago. That's it. Whatever's on the planet is it, and it just goes round and round. And
that's it. Yeah, and there's a lessening supply beneath our feet, which we all drink from pretty much, and you start realizing, oh gosh, and that's slowly becoming polluted, unfortunately. So, we've really got to start thinking that actually the damage that's been done, whilst in the past we've been able to chuck something in a ditch or whatever and it's not really affecting us, that societal, what's the word? I can't think of the word, but the societal kind of attitude of doing that is now coming back to haunt us, and that impact of going, oh yeah, it's not really our problem, whereas now it is our problem, because it's reached that sort of critical point of actually it's all starting to come together and create multiple crises and issues pretty much everywhere you look, be biodiversity, food security, actual security, climate, obviously. There is an awful lot of sort of challenges coming forward, which is why we need solutions like this, where people can understand not just how to design something that's beautiful and helps deliver for the environment, but also delivers for themselves too. So it's kind of that sort of matrices of different values that need to be intrinsically linked to make something truly sustainable, which is what I think is really interesting about the work you're doing. So, because what you can't see for the people watching, and what you definitely can't see if you're just listening, is behind the cameras we have what's it called?
It's called a meditation spiral.
Yeah. Sorry to interrupt, but this episode is sponsored by Water Offsets. If you are working on projects where you might need environmental credits, then they are the people to go to. They specialise in not only biodiversity net gain credits, but also water neutrality and nutrient neutrality too. So if you have an estate, a farm, or some other kind of landowner, or interested in that kind of project, then they could really help you find new ways of funding those projects and diversifying your land and farms, to take you through the whole process. And if you're a developer who's run into problems, then actually they can help provide those credits that you need to unlock your land and get your development done. So check out Water Offsets if you need help with any of those things. Many thanks.
Well, it's very, very simple. It's basically a mown spiral, and the width of the paths are the width of the mower. And I actually show in the book how to make it. So it's basically you just put a piece of stick on top of your mower, the width of the mower, and then you push your mower round in a circle from the centre outwards, and the length of the stick then dictates each path that you leave. So it's super simple to make. But what it does is that it increases your biodiversity by 50%, because you've got 50% more lawn that you're never cutting. It decreases your fuel by 50%, because you're not cutting that bit of, it gives you that bit of lawn, sorry to finish my sentence. It gives you back that amount of time that you would have mown those other bits of lawn. But the amount of biodiversity is amazing, and because it's edge, it's the liminal spaces where exciting things happen, both spiritually and on the ground plane. So because it's edge, you've got the flat lawn, and then you've got all of the grasses and flowers. So much happens. And we had Andy Phillips, the wonderful ecologist, here. He just came back again yesterday, but he was here a few months ago, and he was so excited by all the stuff he was finding, all different types of spiders and all different types of beetles and lots of the bees, ground nesting bees, but also the forage bees, because they come from just nearby and they have their circuits. And this is one of the very good ones. Plus it's been there for a few years and we're on heavy clay. The shorter grass has become a bit mossy, which means in the morning it's the most, well, any time of day, but it's the most soft feeling underfoot to have bare feet. And that contact with the ground is so good for you, because we are conduits from above to below, as man or as woman, you know, standing upright. And you just feel it walking very mindfully. And it's also done on the chakra system, so each of the spirals you can think of a different part of your chakra system if you're interested in that. It's very, very cleansing. And the centre of the lawn is actually on an energy point. So I'm very interested in geomancy and where energy flows on the land. And if you do get to the middle, maybe we'll get you to do it later, you just feel this kind of uplift at the centre, and it's very, very, very special. And it's something which we put in for clients if they're interested, or perhaps a proper labyrinth shape, because bringing that kind of mindfulness or meditation is so good for lots of aspects, but for me, for my creativity as much as anything, to clear all that brain clutter out and to stop thinking. And that's when inspiration just comes, isn't it? When you're just being quiet for a little bit.
Yeah, and that's my biggest problem, switching the brain off is, I think, one of my biggest challenges. But spirituality is not something I've ever really delved much into. I'm a much more traditional in that sense, traditional man, not very spiritual. But I'm very interested in it. I think the value it has is huge. And I've met so many people and seen so many projects where it's really been transformational for people's lives, that even though it's not my thing, I understand the value of it for others. So it's being able to look at things like this and test them out yourself and see what it does for you.
Yeah.
And then
no preconceptions.
Exactly. Yeah, just experience.
Have you tried cold water swimming? That's the other. You said you didn't like the cold, so maybe.
It's not so much that I don't like the cold. I just can't handle the cold very well anymore. Unfortunately, I got very ill a few years ago, and since then I've not managed the cold. I got meningitis when I was in my early 20s, and since then I've really struggled with quite a few things. But I have been in the cold. So when I used to go to Russia every year, and we used to do the sauna and then swim in the snow afterwards. My family used to cut holes in the lakes and dive into the lakes through the ice. But I didn't do that. That's where I drew the line.
That's brave.
But or we used to run through the streets naked, basically in the cold. I think the coldest we did was about -27, I think, once when we were out. So, and the saunas at about over 100 degrees. The saunas are incredibly hot. You have to wear hats, otherwise you pass out.
Wow.
So it's very extreme in like the Russian ones. And I've done it in Norway as well. They have, in Oslo, they've got saunas that float on the fjord.
Right.
And then you come out of the sauna and you can jump into the fjord, which is also quite bracing.
Yes, nice British understatement to go with the Russian
and
the Norwegian way of. Yeah, it's quite bracing.
But the experience for the body is unbelievable, because normally you would do that and then you'd have a tea or something, and you would sit just with a towel on, because even after dunking or something, you're still so hot. And it's kind of like a high. You kind of can sit there just totally content with the world, and your skin feels so much better. You feel so much more alert. But it really is, you feel the cold for a moment, but because of that transition between the hot and the cold, it's such an amazing kind of experience that I was never interested in sauna or anything before, really, or cold water swimming or anything like that. But after having done it a couple of times, again, you kind of twig and you think there's something in this. Actually, it's really quite valuable. I've tried doing hot yoga as well a couple of times, but that was a bit too hot for me. And I'm obviously not very good at yoga, so it's a bit more of a challenge. But I think, again, those things and understanding that and embedding them, we've actually done quite a few projects lately where we've recommended those kind of things, sort of natural swimming with saunas, or other things with just saunas in the garden and, a dunk bucket or something for people to sort of cool down, because it's such an important experience to have. And there's some really interesting spas as well. I went to a really fantastic spa in Cornwall maybe last maybe last year or the year before, and they have a therapy garden, and that's a really great experience. And you go through sauna. Well, you start off in an outdoor sort of shower with lots of scrubs to sort of exfoliate and bring your skin to life. Then you try sort of saunas and things, very cold water. Then you have another experience in a hot tub, but it's very coarse. It's very like rough wood.
Oh,
so it's quite
interesting.
It's very tactile, even though you're in hot water. And then I can't remember what you do after that, but the next, then there's like sensory paths between things as well. So you're kind of exploring with your feet a bit.
Yeah.
And then right at the end, there was sort of some hot water that you just put your feet in, basically around a fire, and you have a tea and things with maybe a blanket. And again, just that, it's very, very simple.
Yes.
But it really is incredibly calming.
Yeah.
And the
mind,
impact
it's a mind body, isn't it?
Yeah, it really is.
So how can you bring your mind into your body? And quite a few of the meditation things I do, to bring your mind into your body, to stop it just jumping around up here, and to ground you.
That's it.
Yeah. And one of the things here is if it's frosty, you can walk barefoot, and then you get a very similar feeling without the hole in the ice and so on. But you get that amazing tingle all day, just like you do if you've done the sauna.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's a wonderful feeling.
So, and I think it's seeing where to combine that with other things. For instance, after a workout, I used to think a sauna would be the worst thing you could ever do. You'd never want to go into a hot sauna for a hot workout, but actually it's fantastic.
It's really good for you.
So so again, and then maybe a cold shower or going in a swimming pool or something that's a bit cool. Really makes you recover much better, and you kind of very ready for sleep and all of it. Or weirdly, it makes you very ready for sleep if you want to sleep.
Yeah.
But if it's in the morning, it really makes you awake.
You ready. Yeah.
So it's kind of weird how it can kind of really support you in where you are in the day as well. It's quite an interesting, very interesting experience.
Well, I think we're understanding so much more about. Some people call them biohacks, don't they? But just getting your hands in the soil releases all the endorphins and the serotonin and that kind of stuff, which I think is a great thing to know and to actually use. We were talking before about the bokashi bin and whether or not you'd actually drink. I don't know where you got that from, but whoever it was, hats off to them. I haven't done it, but yes, but using fermented stuff for your gut and also eating from your garden. So one thing I'm very interested in is collecting stuff from the garden and eating it, like the nettles and like the cleaver and like the mint and the lemon balm and all those kinds of things, and listening to what's appearing in the garden and deciding if it's for you. So like ground elders, really good for gout. The Romans brought it over for gout, so it's good for cleaning the blood. I had to slightly eat my own hat or my own words last year when underneath the bird feeder I had a very nice crop of cannabis just appeared out of nowhere. My team were like, well, Marion, you always say whatever comes is for you. You've got to decide if it's for you. Yeah. But it wasn't the smoking type, it was the hemp type. But even so, CBD oil is really good for you. So I then bought some CBD oil. I thought, right, well, if the garden's telling me to look at CBD oil, I bought some CBD oil, and it was great. Yeah,
I mean, it is interesting as well that how some of these alternative medicines are being used. So a very good friend of mine, unfortunately, is incredibly ill, and he only got given a few years to live. But this was maybe 10 years ago. They gave him, I think, 2 years to live, and that was 10 years ago, and he's still going. And the NHS said to him, okay, they gave him some painkillers and things, like over-the-counter ones. Because of his condition, it stopped his heart, so he had terrible pain. He had a problem with his nerves, his nervous system, so he was in constant pain. And none of these, typical medications worked. And one of the doctors said to him, he said, look, mate, it's from the NHS. He said, we can't condone this, he said, but go to Amsterdam, smoke a lot, tell us if you feel better, and if you do, source it in the UK, was basically their advice, because they said that there's something in it, the THC.
Interesting.
And now he has a proper THC oil. He's got like a prescription for that.
Right.
But it absolutely transformed his health. It went from, really being like really suffering very badly to almost not recovering, obviously, but really seriously like getting things back in order.
Right.
And there's a lot of very interesting stuff happening with that. And the other interesting one is energy, isn't it, and vibrational energy and things like that, that's coming around a lot in terms of healing and understanding frequencies and people's bodies and things like that. And I'm involved in a lot of different things, and some of the things I don't always talk about very much, but I know a lot of people that are working on very experimental technologies and new things like that don't exist currently in our normal world.
Yeah.
And a lot of them are using sort of frequencies and vibrational energy to do amazing things, from healing the body to completely new technologies and things.
But it's old technology as well.
Yeah.
So when I'm talking about standing in the middle of the lawn and feeling that energy spot, I mean, that is vibrational energy. And I'm very into tantric yoga, which is when you're using your energy and you're helping the energy to work in the body, similarly to how you might do it in Tai Chi or Qigong. It's all about how you work with the energy.
Like flows and things like
flows
that.
and things. And technologically, I think obviously perhaps the people you're talking about are using it to see how you can work with those as almost like a biohack, I suppose, is how we can...
it was influencing matter, basically,
Yeah, but I mean, we did it with radio waves. How long do you think it's going to be until we can move without getting in a car?
Now that one is one I haven't seen, but I know. I think there's one thing I can talk about. I don't know, but one of them can regenerate parts of your body within your body.
Yeah.
So if you've got damage to certain cells, it can activate replication of those cells within the body. So it's like non-invasive regeneration. Yeah. Basically. Wow. Which is quite cool.
Yeah.
I can't explain any more than that.
I believe you. Yeah.
But yeah, there's some very interesting stuff coming out and coming forward in technology-wise that uses these things. And I mean, it's funny, you hear about it a lot on like the conspiracy kind of sites, and I thought it was a conspiracy as well. I think, oh, it's rubbish. But now I've started coming across it so much, I'm going, actually, there's got to be something here, because it's kind of uncanny. Yeah. And I don't know if you've seen things like visible sound. Have you ever seen?
No, what do you mean by that?
So if you have like a metal plate with sand or salt or something and you change the frequency, it completely changes the form as geometric shapes.
Yeah, I have,
and it changes the flow of water as well, all of these things.
Well,
crazy.
Mizuho Emoto, who wrote about water and how water carries our energy and how you can see the change in snowflakes or in crystals from how you speak to it and what it does. So that's virtually, I don't know where you would draw the line between spirituality and energy. So I think that's very interesting that you said you weren't into it, because I'd say that they were kind of one and the same.
I think as our understanding changes, you can see the intricacies between these things. And that's when, for me at least, I'm a bit more of a hard facts kind of guy, just because I like to be able to say things like almost not categorically, but as close as I can to go, look, this is the situation, this is what we can do. But I do think as time goes on, I'm sort of going, you can see the sort of flaws in like the current narrative, so to speak, or what we understand currently. I mean, the craziest ones are around things that like, have you ever heard of Graham Hancock? A lot of people are going to be calling this conspiracy. We're going real conspiracy now. But there's a gentleman called Graham Hancock who's done a lot of work into ancient civilizations. Oh, yeah. And, they go into things like, well, who built the pyramids? How were they built? Right. Yeah. And then there's other engineers that have gone, well, it can't have been a ramp, because at whatever pitch would have been required, the ramp would have to be kilometres long, which they definitely didn't do. So they're looking at things like, can you move things with vibration? Did they move things vibrationally? That kind of stuff. And what impact does that have? Some of the ancient structures in, I think it's the Aztecs or the Mayans built. You can stand at the end of huge amphitheatres and talk normally and hear very clearly throughout the whole place. And it's like, how on earth did they design any of that or understand any of that? And I've talked to some other very interesting people who are like, really like, I'll tell you some of them are later, but leading the way in some new technologies and things. And some of the people we've had on the podcast before. And a lot of them are talking very much about sort of like the hallucinogenic things to understand a deeper understanding of like the natural world. Well,
Merlin Sheldrake, he says in his book Entangled Life that he took magic mushrooms and in a controlled way to see if it could help him in his PhD, and it did. And I think there's a big difference between sort of recreational drugs and using things for to a purpose like that. But his mother, so I had a whole Sheldrake weekend when I was supposed to be writing this book. Actually, I do tend to go down rabbit holes. But his father is Rupert Sheldrake, who's a great spiritualist. His brother is an amazing musician who one of his songs includes the tardigrade that we were talking about before, which is a tiny thing in the soil. But his mother is Jill Peirce, who studied vibrational plates and movement of sand and so on. And I think all these things are coexist. And if Merlin hadn't had little enough ego to open his mind and think about all these things, would he have made the incredible discoveries that he's made? And recently, I don't like science fiction because I've always felt really uncomfortable with it, but I've started reading, I mean, I maybe would or wouldn't count it as science fiction, but The Ministry for the Future is a book which apparently is Barack Obama's favourite book. It had its flaws, but I read it because it's looking at a crazy future. And I think that at the moment, we need answers which we might only find from a few. Let's go to the limits of craziness, then claw it back and say, okay, right, what can we actually do? Because,
yeah, that's it.
We can't join the crazies. Not yet. Not yet.
Exactly.
Not till we retire.
Yeah, exactly. But I think it is interesting because it adds another level of depth to kind of what you're doing. And I think there is certain things when you go down the spirituality route where you kind of get to points. This is, again, my observation of other people, because it's not something I've delved into in great detail, but they kind of gain sort of a depth of understanding or a depth of purpose as to what they're doing. And I know another really classic example is ayahuasca. Have you heard of ayahuasca?
Yeah.
So that's the drug that people take in the jungle. And that has a huge amount of sort of backstory about how civilization developed through that drug, which is a hallucinogenic. I think it's the root and a part of another plant. But even the myth of that is really interesting, how people took, I think it's the root. They ate the root first, and it caused them to hallucinate. And in their hallucinations, they saw another plant. So they found that plant, added the two together, and it created the ayahuasca that they take now, which provides access to sort of spirit guides and all of this kind of thing. And a lot of people who have done that have come back questioning sort of not reality, but the state of things and how we need to look at things differently to gain a better understanding of the world itself, and not just in terms of, again, we're going a bit beyond what we were going to talk about in terms of garden design and things here, but going beyond how we traditionally have done things and seeing that actually maybe there are things we don't know or we've forgotten as a species, and actually can we glean something from this, but that perhaps there's another path to sort of enlightenment and all of these kind of things. But it provides, I'm jumping on my words a bit here, but it provides also kind of like a moral baseline as well for you to be able to build upon what you're doing, because you can kind of see these things and understand sort of the interconnectivity of everything.
And I think that baseline is really important, and the intention. I think I know people who've had come real croppers with taking ayahuasca and magic mushrooms and all the rest of it. So I think that it needs to be in a very nurturing, very controlled, very caring environment, where you're really held by a really good shaman or a really good person who knows what they're doing. So I wouldn't advocate people leaping on planes and going, well, planes aren't that sustainable anyway, but going and doing. But what I think is really exciting, and you can get there a lot with meditation. So they talk about a lot of these drugs being trampoline spirituality, because it brings you up for a little bit, and then you go back down. So you're going to go back and look for
it again. Yeah.
For it again. Whereas if you can get there with meditation, then you can stay there. So I think that's just something to mix into the pot if you have listeners and viewers.
It's all very important. We don't condone taking any of these things. We should probably caveat that with this. But it's just an interesting discussion.
It's an interesting discussion.
Interesting discussion.
But I do think it is how are we going to make the breakthroughs? And they always say people that don't know history are consigned to repeat it. But what if we didn't repeat it? What if we actually did something completely new and exciting? It would just be so wonderful. And even if it's not us, even if it's not, well, you're a bit younger than me, but even if it's the next generation or the one after us, if we've been good ancestors and opened that way and not closed things down and not been so egotistical to say you can't do this and you can't think like that, if we actually opened the way to people thinking in different ways, then it would have been worth being alive.
Yeah, absolutely. I think as well, just to go back to the drug point for a moment, sorry to bring it back, but I think one of the other observable things that's coming out of typical actual medicine, the medical field, is very much how drugs tend to be an accelerant of sort of existing conditions. So if you're already in a fragile position, then they obviously make that much worse. Exaggerate it, yeah. And I think going back to the garden design and sort of spirituality side, the understanding of mental health and everything has come along so far that actually a lot of that now is sort of going, okay, right, well, how do we help people using these solutions in terms of designing better places and spaces and these sort of activities that get you in tune with your own body and your own spirituality and your own sort of understanding of self, are incredibly valuable and really, really important. And you see a lot of places now, like Norway now, they can send you to health farms as like a prescription. So we have social prescribing here now for going on walks and things, but they can actually send you away to like a tech-free farm to stay for however long, to sort of detox from sort of modern society. And there's lots of other places now where, like Singapore, for instance, I've been to see some new care homes they built in Singapore, and they're designed around having a view of the landscape or a view across the city for residents, and having everything they need in the building and activities for them, like gardening as part of it on the rooftops of the buildings, huge buildings. And you have it here too, where, you know, some care providers, you know, well, a conversation I had with some care providers was sort of saying to them, you know, you need to look at nature as a care provider as well. It's not just your staff providing care, it's also nature to help people recover and respond better and live a better life. But then also, you don't just have a responsibility to your residents, you have a responsibility to your staff. So you also, in a high stress environment like care or medicine or whatever else, you also want to make sure your staff are well cared for. So putting in provision for places for them to de-stress and them to, you know, be able to take time away, or creating time in the schedule for them to do yoga with residents or by themselves or whatever, is really, really important to, as part of a holistic strategy to address all health concerns, not just caring for someone that's, let's say, broken their leg or broken their hip. It has to go beyond. And caring for the carers.
I think that's so vital. It was lovely in lockdown to see how many people actually realised how important our caring profession is. But even as designers and landscape architects, it's crazy when you find that some people have burnout and are working all hours. And I slightly thought, sort of, be careful what you wish for, because as landscape architects and garden designers, we really wanted people to turn to us and for us to be able to help design spaces. But then after COVID, particularly when everybody realised how important outside was, there was this massive rush of work and people were burning out. And I was thinking, well, this is madness. You know, we entered this profession in order to help people live better. It's not going to work if we're all falling by the wayside because we're working too hard. So I think, how can you care for the carers? One of the places I'm very fond of, and I'm working with more, is called 42 Acres down in Somerset, and it's run by a wonderful visionary, started by Seth and his sister Laura Tabaksnik, and they have a check-in every morning, and that's for the workers, and they really look after each other, and they work with the land and they forage, but they really listen to the land and they listen to each other. And I just think that as a way of working, it's a beautiful thing to do, and it would be great if we could do that in our practices as well.
Absolutely. I know the practice I used to work for, they mandated like an hour's lunch break, and they encouraged everybody to leave the office. And I used to hate it, because I always wanted to try and
get stuff done.
Quickly get stuff done and leave early. But you know, now I can see how valuable that is. I mean, I used to go for walks every day, and now since I've had my daughter, I have to just cram everything in as much as I can into my work day, and I quite often don't leave the house at all now, some weeks pretty much, which is also really not healthy at all. So it is about finding a balance and being able to make sure you make time for all of these things in your day, because it's as important as everything else. And you know, you can see it in your health and things too, you know, especially fitness and things, if you're not even going for a walk, which is something I've certainly noticed. But it is it's all emerging, I think, isn't it, as a sort of a shift in culture, perhaps, and the way we sort of value things, which I think is, you know,
it's really
long
exciting.
It is, yeah.
Yeah, it's a great time to be alive.
It is. So we've skirted around the book quite a lot.
Oh, sorry. I felt like we've talked about it.
Well, no, I think we have. I was just
what else
the principles of it, I think we've covered really well. I was just thinking maybe it might be worth giving a bit of an overview about what else you sort of talk about in the book, of how you sort of take people through the process of sort of designing their own gardens and things they can implement at home
Sure.
and things too.
Yes, so I think, yes, the things you should try at home, not the drug taking, but maybe do not try this at home. So I'm very interested in how you can create a space that is kind to you and that is your place of refuge as well as a place for other people to come into. And so that's why I really firmly believe in being kind to yourself first. Because if you look at a space and think, what would make me happy? Lots of people don't really know what that is. You know, they know that they're supposed to get their grades and their jobs and their money and so on, but actually what makes them most happy, and often it's something really simple like a walk in the park or time with their child or that sort of stuff. So you actually don't need a lot for that. You don't need the latest limestone or the best trampoline or all those kinds of things. So once you know what it is that makes you happy, everything else is kind of on top. And so then how the space works with the elements, how are you going to capture the energy? So the energy comes from the sun. So where the sun is in the different parts of the day, the other energy comes from ourselves. So whether we're going to do the work or whether we want to get somebody else in to help us do the work. Also, the work can be the end in itself. So you're talking about fitness, but rather than getting a leaf blower, if we can do raking, raking is really good for us. It gives us a sense of achievement as well as a little bit of fitness. And that actually has been proven to raise our feel-good hormones. Makes us nicer people, actually. Makes us go out and feel good about what we're doing with other people. So from the energy point of view, then in terms of working with the wind, so filtering wind, and I'm telling you this for everybody else really, because I know you'll know all of this as a landscape architect, but whether you can filter it rather than blocking it so that you don't create eddies and swirls and wind tunnels, whether it's going to help move insects, because actually you don't want completely stagnant air, you want things to move, particularly in greenhouses. So if you can put your greenhouse in a space that is going to get some air current moving through it, which will help with whitefly and all those kinds of things. It's also good just to go and ruffle your plants every now and then. You can be the wind in the greenhouse. Water, we've touched on water, but in a small garden, looking after your soil is the number one for looking after your water. But then you could also have a little pot, a rain garden. You can collect water from the roof. You can clean it. You can have wonderful children's play things with water with no plastic whatsoever. You can build a little dry pond or get an old second-hand trough from somewhere to be a water garden. And that brings in the birds and the bees and the bats and all those sorts of creatures. Leaving crevices, so the walls, the uprights, growing stuff wherever you can in the verticals, growing food in the verticals as well. So I like to use a lot of currants and berries that you can pick and eat. And if you don't get round to it and the birds eat it, then that's fine too. I think if you set yourself up with this is a vegetable garden and the birds must keep off, then that's very different to saying, right, here's a garden with loads of food in it for me if I get round to it, and the birds if I don't get there in time. I think that's it's more fun in a way. And once you're eating your ground elder and so on, then you're not thinking of things as weeds, you're thinking of things as different varieties of thickness, what's the word I'm trying to say, of how much there is of bounty. So then when it comes to growing vegetables themselves, perennial vegetables are fantastic because you don't have to worry about changing the soil and mucking up the soil. And then eating leaves. I mean, at the moment we've got hawthorn, we've got the lime trees coming through. There's all sorts of different leaves which you can pick and add to your salad. Sedum leaves are really crunchy, lovely in your salads.
Young beech leaves taste just like apple skin.
Yeah. All those things you can add to your cow parsley and all those sorts of things you can add to your...
Yeah, there's quite a lot you can do with it too, like the bracts on lime. You can make tea with them.
Yes.
Quite very sweet tea.
Yes.
Telia tea, which is really quite very, very popular in Eastern Europe. And I think we've just lost a lot of that knowledge as well. There's a silver birch over there. You can make wine from it. Yes. Very, very popular in Belarus to drink and Russia to drink birch water, which is just a slightly sweeter water. Yes. And it's not that dissimilar from what you would make maple syrup from. It's not as high a sugar content as maple trees, but it's not far off. So some you could essentially make
tap it,
birch syrup as well, you know, all these kind of things. So there's a lot, and you can make bread from some of them. I think birch, you can make bread from the seeds, and beech as well. You have to blanch it.
Yeah, and plantains like a chia seed, and that grows as a weed. So all these things, I mean, you don't have to go out to forage. You can kind of forage amongst what you're growing. So I think that's really good fun, because it makes a completely different way of thinking. When you're weeding, you're kind of collecting, aren't you? You're seeing what's there for you.
That's it.
And that brings us back to medicines, actually, because some of these things are quite powerful medicines. So you shouldn't go nibbling on everything in case it's more of a medicine or stroke poison than it is a food. But lots of it is good food. We've got primroses over there. They're lovely in tea. Violets at the moment are good in tea. Yeah, so all these things. So so there's that. And then also food from what you buy. So one of the things in the book, I show how you can just get a celery. When you finish your celery at the base, you just stick the base in some water or in some soil, and it grows again. Which it doesn't even have to be organic. And that's a lovely way of sort of tripling your supermarket buy. Splitting out basil, you can make lots of different basils. You can cut basil and put that in water, and it will grow again. Mint is quite difficult to kill, actually.
Yeah.
So mint will grow anywhere. And we had mint from the garden this morning. So that's a lovely thing to grow and eat. I think all these kinds of things. So you can do it in a really small garden as well as a really big garden. Yeah,
and I think as well it leads to another thing that we've not really touched on, but when it comes to food, but it's around like food culture as well. So we at home we tend to buy stuff that's, because we're cheap, we tend to buy stuff that's like going out of date or going off, and we buy that, one, because it's cheap, but also because then we kind of have to do something with it. So it kind of leads us to having to come up with something totally different, or use things we otherwise wouldn't normally eat or cook. And we only really have like fresh vegetables and fresh fruit and things like that. So and most of the meat we buy tends to be reduced. So we've been eating lots of venison lately. But we try and build our sort of diet a bit around that. We're not like going out foraging in the woods, this is coming from supermarkets and shops, but it's a good way to help you understand what else you can do with things. And then if you're doing that from the garden as well, there's just so many things, as you've mentioned already, there's so many plants you can actually eat. It's a bit crazy, really.
It is crazy,
I met some people the other day that have been foraging, and they've been collecting pine needles, and some pine trees, the early pine needles, you can eat. And they have a very, very strong, like citrusy sort of taste. Very interesting. But quite nice, very refreshing.
And the tips of the new cones as well.
If I'd have known we were going to talk about this, I've got some pine cone jam at home. And you actually eat the pine cones, the whole pine cone. You eat it.
Wow.
I'll bring some next time I see you. That's really quite interesting to eat. But that's also but some of these things also have really good health benefits. And because we eat such a limited diet now, you don't get the range of nutrients and benefits you have. And essentially, because it's the very young pine cones, they're quite sappy as well. So you kind of get like these resins and things within the jam. So it's very often used as a jam, but also to treat like sore throats and all of this kind of thing. So it's like multifunctional foods. And in Russia, interestingly, actually, they have a very different sort of tradition around honey. So they have lots of I don't know how true this is, but I remember we go into a honey fair, and they have different honeys allocated to different parts of the body. So they'll have a big chart of like a person, and they'll say, if you've got this problem with your lungs, you need this honey. If you've got this problem
depending
with your
on what
leg,
the bees have been feeding on.
what the bees
well,
have
that
been
makes
feeding
perfect
on.
sense, doesn't it?
Well, it makes absolute sense, but I've never seen it anywhere else.
Interesting.
So it's quite surprising how they have made use of like these things and sort of tailored them, and actually that the benefits you can get from like just a diverse diet.
And also if a creature has nibbled on your plant, so if like a slug's eaten a bit or so on, not to spurn it, because actually then it will have some of the phytochemicals which the plant would have put out in order to repel the insect. It's really good for us too. So I think that helps, particularly if you've got children that don't like holes in plants, to explain it's actually better for them.
That's it. Well, it is interesting because some plants that are bitter tend to have a component in them that is toxic to us in very large quantities. But you can still eat the plants, it's fine, but you obviously don't eat anything that you don't know what it is. But some plants that are bitter, and I was reading somewhere recently that bitterness can cause some sort of chemical reaction within your body that's incredibly beneficial, but I can't remember exactly what it is. So there's some quite interesting things that happen when you do have this variety of foods, activating different things. And the same goes for not eating with fasting. You know, there's a lot of things coming out around fasting and the benefits of that too, for helping clear the body and help dealing with cancers and tumours and all of these kind of things, and tackling that. So there's kind of where I was going with this was it all comes back again into the spaces and the people that you do these things with. So as you were saying, it's understanding what people like and enjoy from their gardens. For me, I've always loved having friends over, having a fire pit, cooking something very slowly, you know, a big joint of meat or something that's cooked very slowly, responsibly sourced, but really good quality, that we can sort of all enjoy together. And to me, that's always been a way that I've kind of like spent time with friends or caught up with friends over time. So being able to appreciate that sort of culture and bring those elements in, I think is really important to like help build your understanding of what you enjoy and what you're happy with, tying that to sort of your garden as well, and sort of tying all these different things together, you know, food, garden, friends, all of those kind of things. And being able to bring that together is obviously, you know, a major part of the work we do.
Yeah, it makes it so rewarding.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and hopefully the clients invite you over for a barbecue and things as well when it's done. So
that'd be nice.
Yeah, that's the main perk of doing these things. To all my clients out there, please keep inviting me. But yeah, and I think what was the other thing we were going to talk about quickly? Moving on slightly, we were going to talk a bit about sustainability. So obviously your work with the Sustainable Landscapes Foundation, you've been doing a lot on, we've obviously talked a lot about sustainability, but you're looking kind of at the industry and what the industry can do to become more sustainable. It's a bit more of a serious conversation.
Well,
but
I mean, it's crazy.
It's
crazy that we can be working in a green industry and doing any harm. I mean, that just struck me as madness. So when I met Eric Anderson 5 years ago, I think, we met at an awards ceremony. Oh, we met on Twitter first of all, but then we met at an awards ceremony. And we were just saying how crazy it is that things were being judged on their size and the amount of money that was being spent and what it looked like, when actually it should be being judged on the good it was doing and the longevity, really, the long-term plan. And from that, we then brought lots of people together and talked about, got really fabulous leaders of their own knowledge areas, like we were saying before, bringing in the experts, to just say, well, how could we gather together our information in a really cross-body way? Because we're really fortunate, you and I are both members of the Landscape Institute, also I'm a member of the Society of Garden Designers, member of Barley, there's the APL, the Horticulturist Trade Association, lots of other people besides, all doing good, but they have lots of different things that they're doing, they need to be working at, whereas we were only looking at sustainability. So if we could bring together all those people with just that core focus, then we could just gather together so much information and help people, provide a platform so that people are thinking, well, and that's the other thing, which is I do touch on in the book, is what are the properties of different materials, brick versus concrete versus limestone versus sandstone, just to use paving, for example, and before you even get into wood and so on, different types of woods. What are the characteristics of those that make them more or less sustainable? Not just how expensive, but where they come from, the fossil fuels which are used in terms of making them, but transporting them, how long they're going to last, how can they be recycled, or have they been recycled beforehand? All those sorts of things. So we want to create a platform whereby people can go for that information, whether they are a sole practitioner, garden designer, a person, you know, I hate to use the word public because we're all public at some stage, or one of the really big companies, the Arabs of the world, who we've worked with closely to develop part of what we're doing. Then how do you, once you know what good looks like, how do you tell if you are doing good? How do you measure it? How do you measure how much good you're doing? And now we have biodiversity net gain measurements, we've got some of the carbon capture. So actually in the time that we've been building up this foundation, a lot of people, a lot of clever people are thinking fast as well, because we all need to think fast. And Aaron and I always joke, if somebody else comes up with the idea and wants to do it instead, then that's great. You know, we'll give them everything we've done so far. Let's not double do.
Yeah,
Let's
absolutely.
all work together to go the same way. But is there an accreditation system that we can develop that will tell people if they're doing really well in these areas? And then how could we link that to awards? But also, how can we link that to policy? So I have said right from the outset how brilliant it would be if your garden could be rated like your fridge, and you could get a reduction on your council tax, for example. If you're doing good in your garden, then that should be recognised. So if you're sinking carbon or providing biodiversity net gain or something, even in your tiniest square patch in the middle of a city, how good would it be if we could have that recognised? So I think all of those sorts of things are what we're trying to work towards in the Sustainable Landscape Foundation, and what I'm writing about, and what we're all really working towards.
No, it's very exciting, and I think you're right in the terms that a lot of things are starting to come out and be implemented, and it's amazing how many more are sort of coming up and being discussed now, because we've got nutrient neutrality and water neutrality, and people have been talking about energy neutrality, and today, actually, and a couple of times now, we're talking about agricultural offsetting. What's the impact on food production of big rewilding projects or whatever else? Is it actually reducing the amount of food we're producing? Well, that's making us less food secure as a country. How can that be offset? How can that be mitigated? So it's opening up a lot of doors as well, because again, it's a lot of its trade-offs. You start looking at these things going, it's kind of a rabbit hole in a way. And everything has a knock-on impact, so it's identifying those impacts and how you implement solutions. I think one thing I'd be really interested to see from it is work on what you could do as a practice in terms of, I don't know if you've looked at this at all, but like within a practice, what could you do to make your own sort of practice policy better, and what sort of learning there is from other practices that have tried to do something like that. I think that could be very interesting, because my experience, which you kind of touched on earlier, is there's a lot of organizations out there all doing great things, but because they're doing great things, they're kind of missing what they're doing themselves and their own impact that goes for individuals or organizations. They often don't look at it because they're doing something environmental.
For somebody else, yes,
because it's kind of going, well, actually, we're designing all of these great spaces and restoring nature. And I've always kind of been like, great, yeah, we should carry on doing that, obviously. But actually, as an organisation, there's still a lot we could do ourselves in-house. So that's something I've been quite interested to sort of understand what practices and things can do on that front too.
I mean, the short answer as designers is that most of our impact is in the influence we have outside the studio.
Absolutely, yeah.
We did a carbon footprint for my studio, which is small. And the biggest, our biggest carbon expenditure is on travel. Yeah. So that's what, fairly obvious. We use the sustainable print company. We print very little, but when we do print something, then they will print a bound copy of something for a client, and it's all done with through their very careful means. But yes, travel is the big one. So in lockdown, we were quids in, but now we do a lot of we did a lot of remote working anyway. But we still do remote working. That helps with people's quality of life as well, as long as they use that free hour of travel to do something good rather than working as well.
That's it, and it is very difficult because, as you say, it's the impact of. We're lucky because the impact of what we do is the big impact in terms of our actions, helping clients and understanding these things. And I mean,
it's the influence we can have outside.
Yeah, absolutely. And I was having this discussion the other day because lately I've had to fly quite a lot, and I've got to fly quite a lot more coming up. And we were sort of going, well, it's not really very sustainable, is it? As environmentalists flying around everywhere. And we sort of just sat there and went, one project we'd looked at with some water, we could save 16 billion litres of water for one small part of a city, and you're sort of going, yeah, well, actually, that is pretty valuable that we go and deal with these things. So it's also about understanding that there is the influence role is incredibly important, and if you're not there, the influence isn't as great or as valuable as perhaps it should be. So it's kind of factoring all those things in, but then how do you mitigate that as well as best you can, if you can?
Yeah, and I think
how do you do that? Where
it.
do you look? Where do you go? And what do you do?
Yes.
And we see it now. We were talking about this slightly briefly earlier. talking about sort of water neutrality and biodiversity and all of these things. And I know that some companies now are starting to look at their own footprint in that sense. It's not just carbon, it's the impact of our sort of lifestyle on biodiversity. So that's the impact of the area of land that is required to produce our food, the area of land that we sort of live on, the amount of water we use, can that be offset somewhere else, this kind of thing. So there's a lot of people starting to sort of look at those things too, going beyond just carbon and starting to look at, you know, water availability and sustainability and biodiversity as well, and helping sort of fund that transition. So it all goes back into sort of ESG sort of territory.
Yeah, it does. And actually, I mean, maybe just to finish, then how can we have influence as individuals? We can have influence as individuals in our gardens, but really it's how we spend our money. So you going to take the food at the end of the day, you say it's because it's cheap. Actually, what a fantastic thing you're doing to use it up so it doesn't go to landfill.
Yeah, indeed,
that's
true,
a big deal. It's also quite fun to be creative with. I mean, I'm the same. It's like, what on earth am I going to do with what's in the fridge? Well, let's think something up. And I love the river food approach, you know, because they send you vegetables and you get the vegetables and then you're thinking, what am I going to do with these? But they do also give you recipes. But I think in terms of our spending, every decision we make about a piece of clothing or a cup or, you know, even this book, if you can buy it online or whatever, or get it from the library, then those are all things which we can influence, aren't they?
Yeah.
And who we invest with and all that kind of stuff. And if we do invest, then I've never been one for going to annual general meetings, but maybe that's something we need to start doing. Go and start sort of, I don't think I'd be very good at table thumping, but maybe voting or making our voices known a bit.
Yeah, no, I think that's a very, very good point, and I think a really good point to end on as well. So thank you so much for your time. Thank you for having us in your beautiful garden.
Thank you for coming.
And you're very welcome. I'd love to come back, actually. It's so beautiful. Yeah, well, we'll put a link out for the book and everything as well. And everybody keep an eye out for the Sustainable Landscapes Foundation when that comes out.
Thank you.
Brilliant. Cheers.
Lovely to see you. Thank you.
Likewise. Sorry to interrupt, but we have a quick message from one of our sponsors. And it's that we're thrilled to announce that Marshalls is the sponsor of this episode. As the UK's leading supplier of sustainable concrete and natural stone products for the built environment, Marshalls is committed to doing the right things for the right reasons, delivered in the right way, ethically and sustainably. From fairly traded stone to low carbon concrete bricks, Marshalls believes we can create better spaces, putting people, communities and the environment first. Find out more about the firm's green initiatives in our podcast links below. I hope you've enjoyed this episode. If you're interested in finding out more about how you can build complexity into gardens to benefit nature, but also create interest for people too, then check out our episode with John Little, where we talk about just that. Don't forget to like, subscribe and share to friends and colleagues who might be interested too. And a huge thank you to our incredible sponsors, Marshalls, Water Offsets and Vectorworks, our kind supporters, Gillian Goodson Design and the Birmingham Botanical Gardens, and of course, NDLA and Monsterdon for powering this episode. As well as a big thank you to Marion for her time and allowing us to film in her fantastic garden. Many thanks.